Thanks so much, Elspeth. My name is Gary. I'm one of the leaders of the church here. It's great to be together. Can I just encourage you over this month of August? We always do this in summer. Summer's feels like a strange time for lots of churches. It always has felt like an unusual time for us as a church. We get lots of people away on holiday, so things seem quite quiet, especially against the backdrop of everything that's kind of changed just recently. So just make the most, particularly these Sunday gatherings, of maybe getting a chance to speak to people that you haven't done previously. It's just a really nice opportunity. Things are going to feel a lot different come the autumn. So just make the most of this, kind of as we get used to things together. I think there's a great opportunity over these next few weeks just to make the most, to maximize kind of this August period. One of the things that it's a very British thing, isn't it? We feel very awkward starting conversations. And so one of the classics, if we've moved past the weather, is what do you do? What's your job? Now, that often produces some very interesting conversations. For me, it generally makes the conversation even more embarrassing and even more awkward than it was previously. Because when I say to someone, I'm a pastor or I work in a church, it's normally met with kind of a look of sort of blank incomprehension. And often, actually, which is good, will then be a question around, well, what does that mean? What do you do? I have no idea what somebody like that does. And of course, I wouldn't expect somebody to know. We don't really have much of a sense of the church as a nation, so there'd be no expectation that someone would know what a church leader would do. But I think when you come to the church as well, there's a huge amount of confusion. What is a church leader? What do they do? And different church traditions, if you are from kind of an array of different church backgrounds, which we do have here at Redeemer, different titles kind of seem to confuse everything. Priests, bishops, vicars, ministers of religion, pastors, elders, apostles, spiritual directors, any number of different kind of titles that seem to apply to this category of spiritual leaders or church leaders. On one of my kids' birth certificates, I was remembering it this week. If you've never seen a birth certificate, the full one has the occupation of the parents. And on one of my children's birth certificates, it says that my occupation is a clerk of the holy orders. That's not a joke. It really says that. I have no idea what that is. But I am one, apparently. I feel like it should come with an outfit, is what it feels like, some kind of costume of some sort. But, far more seriously, I think when it comes to the area of spiritual leaders, there's been a huge amount of concern recently. There's been a lot of focus on church leaders, much of it negative, due to some very high-profile cases of some very well-known leaders being exposed. And there have been cases of, I think, at best, poor leadership, and at worst, abusive leadership. And many people have been damaged and shaken by what they have experienced firsthand. But also many people have viewed from a distance and have been left saying, well, what is church leadership about? If I seem to keep hearing story after story of high-profile leaders making a mess of things, what is church leadership? So this part of Titus is extremely helpful because the Apostle Paul is writing this part of the Bible to a brand new leader in a church, or a kind of a group of churches. To Titus is the name of the young leader, and new churches are being planted, but Paul is no longer with those churches, and so he's really instructing Titus on what needs to be in place for those churches to flourish. He says, this is what I want you to do to make sure those churches remain healthy. And verse 5 is Paul's phrase is to be put in order. And part of that process is that church leaders are to be appointed. And Paul describes the kind of leaders that those people should be in these verses. They're called a few interchangeable things in the passage here. In verse 5, they're called elders. In verse 7, they're called stewards or overseers. And then in other places in the New Testament, the same word or the same idea is referred to by pastor or by under shepherd. But they all point to the same role. And so I'll use different words kind of interchangeably today because they really mean the same thing when it comes to how the Bible uses them. Now, today is not everything there is to say about church leadership by any means. It's not even everything there is to say about it out of this passage. There's lots we won't get to. But I want us to look at three things. I want us to look at the nature of a leader, but understanding the nature of a leader shows us two other really wonderful things. It shows us the nature of the church and something about the nature of Christ, the nature of Jesus. So we'll look at the nature of a leader, the nature of the church, and then the nature of Christ. Now, just before this first point, can I say this? I am aware that I'm speaking about church leadership as a church leader. I know that. With Tom and Alex here, we have the privilege, the responsibility as pastors of leading Redeemer. And so by extension, everything I say about church leadership today is about us. And because I'm the one at the front, it's about me. That's unusual. I know that's unusual. And yet, here's the invite. The invite is to judge me and to judge us according to what we find in the Bible. This is what we passionately believe as a church. The Bible is our authority, our rule, our guide in all of life. And so we all sit under its authority, including every Sunday and especially today, the one who's speaking about this. All right? So this is all of us. We're under the same authority, which is God's word speaking to us. So let's step into this together. Here's the first thing, the nature of a leader. There's a flow to what Paul writes here. Paul wants to help Titus serve the church. And so he starts with a vision of how the truth of Jesus changes and impacts upon everybody's life. He wants to see the gospel of Jesus, the good news of who Jesus is, of what he's done, form everything that they're about as a church. And that's why the letter starts with a focus on the gospel. And that's what you get in the first 4 verses. Because what you're going to see over the coming weeks, if you stick with us, you'll see that the church has already begun to get in a mess. They've lost sight of the clarity of Jesus, the focus on Jesus, and a group of others who are teaching a slightly different message, false teachers, have come in. And Paul wants to call them back to keeping the truth of Jesus central. Now, why is that important when we think about church leadership? It's because the place that Paul starts, when he says that he wants to make sure a church keeps the gospel central, is by making sure the right leadership is in place. Look at verse 5, where Elspeth began our reading from. This is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what remained into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. So Paul has started his letter. He says, I want the gospel to be at the center of the whole church. And then he doesn't come to verse 5 and say, oh yeah, I've got a few thoughts about church leadership. I'm not sure where they should go. Let's put them here. Let's get them done at the beginning and then share some information about church leaders. He doesn't do that. He says part of the way you do that, part of the way the gospel is kept central in the church is by having the right leaders in place. That is to say, the role of a church leader is to make sure that the gospel is at the heart of the church. Now, there are other things a leader might have to do, but that one is central, which is why every single church leader needs to know the truth of the gospel. Look at verse 9. It says that he must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and also rebuke those who contradict it. Now, what's interesting is every other qualification about what a church leader should be is about their character. Now, we'll come on to that in a moment. But this one in verse 9 is the only ability-based one. They should be able to teach sound doctrine. That means they should know the truth of the gospel, and they should be able to teach that gospel to other people. Now, that doesn't mean that every church leader should be the most remarkable and gifted preacher that you've ever heard. Teaching when it comes to the Bible is done in a whole host of different places and different contexts. So that could be one-to-one, it could be in small groups, it could be to 20 people, to 100, to 1,000 people. Most of the churches here in Crete were house churches, so they would have been much smaller. But it doesn't really matter where it happens. An elder, a church leader, needs to have that ability. They need to know the truth well enough, not just to teach it, but did you notice, to rebuke those who drift from it. to basically see what was happening, to see where something might go, and to say, hold on, no, this is drifting away from the truth of the gospel. We need to come back, and we need to keep the truth of what Jesus says central. See, church leaders need to see where that's happening. They need to hold on to the truth of the gospel. Now, let me just tell you one thing that this means from the very beginning. I think this is really important. All of this means that eldership is not about elders. I know that sounds a bit of a strange thing to say, but what I mean is the end point of elders, the end point, the reason there are elders is so the church can be built up. It's so the church can thrive and flourish. A church doesn't exist to give a leader a platform. A church doesn't exist to give a pastor a job. Elders exist to serve, to equip, and to strengthen the church. That's exactly how Paul introduced himself at the start of the letter in verse 1. Paul, a servant of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ, for the sake of the faith of God's elect, for their knowledge of the truth which accords to holiness. I love that. Paul, he says, my whole role, my whole life, everything I am is for the sake of God's people, so they may grow and flourish in their knowledge of Jesus. And every church leader follows that blueprint. There's probably no clearer place you find it in the whole of the Bible than in Ephesians chapter 4. And if you get to that verse, in verse 11 and 12, it says that God gives elders and pastors to the church to equip the saints for works of service. Not to do all of the ministry, but to see others flourish and equipped to live out who they are in Jesus. I think one of the big misunderstandings about church leadership is that somehow it's the top of a pyramid. Or that when you look at church leaders, they are the equivalent of like the CEO or the bosses of the church, but that isn't the role of an elder. The role of an elder is to serve for the good of the church. An elder exists so that everyone in the church is able to flourish and grow and serve Jesus in the gifts that God has given them. It's a humble privilege. It's not some kind of promotion. It's not a ladder. Which is why Paul says there's such a stark contrast with the false teachers. So he's laying out what a church leader should look like. And he then just comes into saying, well, let me show you what it doesn't look like by showing you what the false teachers are doing who've come amongst them. I won't spend a whole lot of time here, but the role of an elder with the false teachers who are causing problems, look at verse 10. He says, this is what the false teachers are like. There are many who are insubordinate, empty talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision party. They must be silent, since they're upsetting whole families by teaching for shameful gain what they ought not to teach. Now, there's a lot of problems in these false teachers, but the main one seems to be that they've just copied the culture around them. They've just bought into the model that they see in the culture around them. And Paul actually quotes one of their poets, a Cretan poet called Epimenides. He was someone who they kind of respected and honored kind of in that culture. And he quotes him in verse 12. He says, one of the Cretans, a prophet of their own, says, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. And in one of the strongest put-downs in the whole of the New Testament, he says, this testimony is true. So now he's particularly thinking of the false teachers here. He says Cretan society was self-centered. That's what even your own poets say. They're driven by shameful gain, and the false teachers have been sucked in. They want to get everything they can from leadership. They want to get everything they can for themselves. Leadership is about them. But Paul is saying church leaders should be the reverse, the absolute opposite. They aren't there for gain, for selfish reasons. They exist for the church. So here we go. The hallmark of church leadership is service, not self-promotion, not a platform to show off gifts, not a place to seek validation or praise, but a place to serve for the good of the whole church. And in nearly every place where church leadership has become toxic and damaging, you'll see the focus has shifted. You'll see that it's become about the leader and not the church. So Paul says, look, this is the nature of leadership. But I'm going to draw a few more things out by showing you what it tells us about the nature of the church. The nature of the church. I hinted at it earlier, but here's what's fascinating about the passage. Being a church leader isn't really about what you can do, it's about who you are. It's about character and not gifts. And there's a summary statement when Paul explains what to look for in a church leader. He uses it twice in 2 verses. In verse 6 and verse 7, he says they are to be above reproach. Another way you can translate that is blameless. Now, it doesn't mean perfection. If it meant perfection, then nobody would be able to lead in the church. It doesn't mean perfection, but it does mean, it's a word that means good reputation. It's a word that points to a sound character. And Paul fills out what that means in the following verses. He starts with 5 negative characteristics that are to be avoided in the life of a leader. Look at verse 7. For an overseer, as God's steward, must be above reproach. He must not be arrogant or quick-tempered, or a drunkard, or violent, or greedy for gain. Now, I'm not going to unpick all of those right now, but I want you just to notice this. All of those things run contrary to the gospel. They go against the gospel, the essence of the gospel. What do I mean? Well, the gospel says that Jesus needed to die to deal with the brokenness of my life. So if I'm a leader, how can I be arrogant when the cross has humbled me to the dust? The gospel says that God is endlessly patient with my stubborn heart. And the more that sinks into my heart, the more I will have patience with others rather than having a quick temper. The gospel gives me the very life of God, which satisfies my deepest longings. In Jesus, I get the greatest treasure, so I don't need to find my worth in alcohol or in money anymore. The gospel is the ultimate word of peace, that God speaks to my soul. So I find my anger and my violence towards others begins to shrink and not grow. Paul is really saying this. Is the leader a person whose life is becoming more and more like Jesus? Is the Holy Spirit bringing the fruit of the gospel into that person's life? And it's the same really with the positive list that follows in verse 8. This is what they're to be like. They are to be hospitable, a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. Again, all of those things flow from a life that's centered on Jesus. They are the fruit that the Spirit produces in the life of every believer and in the life of a leader as well. We're really being told that church leadership is about character and not primarily about gifts. Now, I want to just pause and just think about that for a moment. Because if you were to read this as a job description for a leader, this is not what you would expect. I think what we would probably expect listed first is all the gifts required. When we tend to think of leadership, we tend to think of it in terms of ability, even of vision and dynamism and boldness and courage. But it doesn't really have a whole lot to do with character, with who a person is. So take, for example, probably the most high-profile leaders that we have are our political leaders. And often if a scandal is broken in their private lives, you'll often hear people say, well, it doesn't matter what they do in private as long as they're good at their job. You know, as long as they do their job well, who cares what their private life looks like? Now, listen, I completely understand what's being said there. We should expect competent leaders in organizations. That really matters. We need the right people doing the right roles. But to say that who a person is at a character level doesn't matter. That what a person's private life is has no bearing on the rest of their life is not a biblical view. The Bible doesn't let us draw categories neatly like that, especially when it comes to church leadership. So let me put that in the most concrete terms I can. When you're thinking about a church leader, you may have the most intelligent, strategic, gifted person, someone who is a truly impressive person and would be in any walk of life. But Paul says that's not where you go first. Where you go first is saying, do they have the kind of character that's being shaped and formed by Jesus? Do they love him? Do they love other people? Any other paradigm of leadership is wrong in the church. I think this is one of the reasons we're seeing so many issues with church leaders right now. The church in the West has drifted to the wrong place. It's become way more obsessed with leaders who look good, who look impressive, who can stand up to comparison with other successful organizations. Gifts have been elevated above character, but that isn't the view of the Bible. Now, you may be thinking, well, hold on, I thought he said this was a point about the nature of the church, but you're still talking about leaders. So what does this have to do with the church? Well, the need for leaders to be like this, I think, reflects two vital things about the church. Here's the first one. The church embodies what it believes. That's why all these things matter in a church leader, because a church leader is a follower of Jesus. They're called to point everyone in everything they do towards Jesus. So their life must be one that's becoming more and more like Jesus. And it's the same for us as a church as well. All Christians are pursuing a life like this, not just leaders. And that tells you a huge amount about the church. How the church lives reflects the truth of its message. The message of the church is why the church looks the way it does. It's not just a coincidence. It is we are the visual demonstration of the message that we believe. In other words, the church isn't selling a product. We don't have a product to sell to the world. If you're not a Christian in here today, that you may think that, and I'm so sorry for when Christians and churches give you that impression, but we don't have a product to sell to the world. We aren't trying to sell the gospel to the world, and as long as we do that, it doesn't matter what we look like as a people. No, we are formed by that gospel. We are shaped by the message that we are called to proclaim, and that shows the world the truth of what we believe. We embody what we believe. And that's why church leaders look the way that they do. That's why God says it's important that this happens. But here's the second truth about the church. It's because the church is a family and not an institution. Did you notice that Paul starts by talking about what a church leader's home looks like? Look at verse 6. If anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife, and his children are believers and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. There's a lot of questions there, a lot of questions I think that I can't get to, because we go down there, I'll be there for the next 20 minutes. But here's what Paul is saying. He says a church leader's home matters. The way they are in their home environment matters. And why is that? Well, I mean, at one level, it just makes sense, doesn't it? If church leadership is all about the gospel, it has to be changing the life of a leader. And there is no clearer place where you will see how different their life is in every circumstance than in the home. See, where are you going to see if I'm patient? You're going to see it when my kids keep asking me for stuff over and over and over again. The two older ones are here today. The two younger ones are with my parents, so we could be really open this afternoon. But that's where you're going to see it. Where are you going to see if I've got a quick temper? You're going to see it with my wife. You can see it with my children. That's the place you're going to see it clearly. Which is why it's really important that leaders have people from the church family in their homes. Because where else are people going to see this? But there's something else too. You see, an elder has to be leading in their own home, their own family, because the church is God's family. The church is the family of God. And it makes sense then, if the gospel is the thing that's being used to nurture in the family, the biological family, then it's the same thing that will happen in the church family. And of course there's differences, but Paul says that the parallels, the overlaps are really significant. This is how one writer puts it. He says, the way a man leads in his own family will tell you a lot about how he will lead in God's family, the church. If he's domineering in his home, he's likely to be domineering in the church. If he fails to take responsibility in his home, he's likely to shirk responsibility in the church. Paul says to Titus, the most important reference for a church leader is what goes on in his home life. The Puritans, who were a much misunderstood group of Christians a few hundred years ago, they used to talk about a pastor needing to shepherd the little flock well, meaning their family, before they could shepherd God's flock. See, the church is God's family. Faith in Jesus makes the church a family. We become children of God. We're drawn into the family of God. Which is why the most common image for the church in the Bible is the family. There are other ones, but the family is the most persistent one. And it makes sense then, doesn't it, for its leaders to look like this. Leaders are to help form those deep, loving family relationships within the church, to help make sure churches are places for loving, serving, blessing, belonging to God and belonging to other people. Look, we could say so much more, but I'm going to bring us to our last point here. We looked at the nature of a leader, the nature of the church. Here's the third thing, the nature of Christ. Just take a step back. All the things that I've said so far, how would you describe it? I think you could describe it like this. An elder is to give of themselves for the sake of the church. An elder should give of themselves for the sake of the church. Now, does that remind you of anything? Does that remind you of anyone? Elders mirror in the tiniest way what Jesus has already done perfectly. Because Jesus didn't just give of himself to serve the church. Jesus gave his life to make the church, to form the church. He laid down his life on the cross so there is a church. There is a beautiful description of a leader that runs throughout the Bible. They're often described as being under-shepherds. And you get that right from the Old Testament through to the New Testament. God gives leaders as under-shepherds for his people. But I want you to notice that they're only ever as under-shepherds. Now, why is that? It's because the role of shepherd is already taken. Because from the very beginning, God said, I will shepherd my people. I will lead them. I will feed them. I will care for them. I will protect them. I will know them because I love them. There's a moment in John's Gospel, one of the accounts of the life of Jesus, where Jesus is teaching. And in a single phrase, he combines all of this. In John chapter 10 and verse 11, Jesus says this, speaking of himself, he says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Jesus stands up as he's teaching, and he says, everything you've seen about me, everything has been pointing to the fact that I am the divine shepherd. I am, says Jesus, the great shepherd who will lead his flock. And his love is so great. His commitment and compassion so deep that he says, I will lay my life down for my sheep. I will give of myself for my sheep. Now, right at the end of John's Gospel, you may know this, but Jesus is speaking to Peter. Do you remember that? And if you know anything of the story of Jesus, you'll know that Peter was the one who betrayed Jesus. He betrayed him 3 times. On the night he was betrayed, and he abandoned him. And yet we find at the end of John's Gospel, Jesus has plans for Peter. And Jesus is calling him to serve as one of the foundational leaders of the early church, one of the first people who will lead in what would go on to grow and flourish into the church that grows around the world today. And famously, Jesus asks him 3 times if he loves him. Do you remember that? He betrayed Jesus 3 times, and 3 times Jesus asks him now, do you love me? And each time Peter says, yes, Jesus, I do love you. Jesus, you know I love you. And Jesus answered back with something beautiful every time. Do you remember what he says? He says, if you love me, if you will be a leader in my church, if you're going to go on and do this, you will care for my sheep. For my sheep. 3 times in John chapter 21, Jesus comes back to him and he says, okay, then feed my sheep. Tend my sheep. Feed my lambs. I love this. Jesus, he doesn't say to him, Peter, over to you. They're yours now. They belong to you. You're going to be a church leader. Now they're yours. He doesn't. He says, Peter, if you love me, if you care about the things that I care for, if your heart is moved as you follow me and serve me, if you will be a leader in my church, you will help care for my sheep. But never forget, they are mine. Here is what that means. It means the church belongs to Jesus. It doesn't belong to leaders. It doesn't belong to pastors. The great shepherd is Jesus, and he tends his flock. The only role a pastor will ever have is to point towards Jesus as the great shepherd. And if a pastor fails to do that, they are not doing the job that God has called them to. Let me finish by saying this. If you are damaged, if you feel hurt and disillusioned, I understand. I think some of the greatest heartache and heartbreak that can be done in a person's life can be at the hands of a leader that they trusted. I know that certainly some of my greatest heartbreak has been in exactly that form. But I want to tell you that the great shepherd will bring healing because he is gentle and he is good and he will tend to you. Don't let the abuses done in his name blind you to the goodness of him as the great shepherd. Come to him. Pour out your heart to him. He can always be trusted. And if you've been left cynical and suspicious, then can I encourage you to look to Jesus? If you just read one too many article about church leaders that's just made you sick, if you look now at the whole institution of the church and you just say, I feel like I'm done with everything, then here's my encouragement. Jesus is the reason the church exists. So look again to him. Look to him for the first time. And here is what you will find. You will find one who is infinitely good, who is infinitely beautiful, who is infinitely precious. He is the one that you need to encounter today. So come to him, discover him, find him. Let me pray for us. Father, I want to thank you for these verses. Thank you for everything that they show us about the nature of church leaders. Lord, I pray that we as pastors in this church would serve your people really well here. God, enable us to be the kind of leaders that you want us to be, that this church deserves and needs, God. We feel humble, we feel fear and trembling. Please just equip us and many more into the future that will lead this church as you continue to just have whatever plans you have for us in our city into the future. Father, I pray for those who are feeling just raw and bruised and broken, disillusioned and just sick to the stomach of everything that they've seen in terms of the failures of leaders. God, I pray that you would point their eyes towards the great shepherd, Jesus. Even the best under-shepherd will only ever be an under-shepherd to point towards the great and glorious sheep. A shepherd, rather, he laid down his life for the sheep. And Jesus, now as we just continue to respond to what you've been speaking to us about in your word, we pray that we would see in the bread and the wine as we take communion the fact that you laid down your life so freely, so willingly. And I pray that in taking bread and wine, we would even know some more of that healing process of remembering and knowing more of your shepherdly care for us. We want to thank you and praise you for who you are and what you've done for us, Jesus. Amen.